How to rethink society. Just as we have seen in previous episodes of Politikon, whether with the political liberalism of John Rawls or the libertarianism of a Robert Nozick. In the last episode, it was also possible to see the falsely egalitarian claims of Luck egalitarianism. Luck egalitarians in fact only duplicated economic domination and in wishing to integrate merit and individual responsibility into their theory of social justice. A coherent egalitarianism. And remember with Amartya Sen that any political theory seeking a just society is based on the promotion of the equality of something. A coherent egalitarianism must therefore fight all forms of domination and thereby prevent social relations from being affected by exploitation, marginalization, violence. It is to this ambition that responds a renewed political theory, the Neo-republicanism, of which one of its leading authors is the philosopher Philip Pettit. We will see that understanding republicanism as a normative political philosophy for thinking about a just society will enable us to understand both how liberalism is perhaps not the best defender of freedom and how, in France, one is perhaps not as republican as one would like to believe it. Republican thought was submerged in the 20th century by both liberalism and Marxism. Historians and philosophers have, however, given themselves the task of giving back vivacity to this current of political philosophy born during antiquity. Among them, we can count the New Zealander historian John Greville Agard Pocock, and his book The Machiavellian Moment appeared in 1975, or Quentin Skinner with the book The Foundations of Modern Political Thought published in 1978. Pocock and Skinner were interested in what was called civic humanism, which took off during the Renaissance and in Italian cities with thinkers such as Coluccio Salutati, Leonardo Bruni, and more famously with Machiavelli. For civic humanism, and largely inspired by Aristotle's political thought, the human being is by nature a political being who reaches his true humanity only in participation in civic and political life. This citizenship takes place in a republic ordered by men themselves for the common good and the freedom of each. This freedom is never better embodied than in the figure of the citizen who participates in political life. Taking part in political decisions makes one truly free in the sense that one does not suffer the will of others. In this perspective, freedom is lived in common, in the common development of laws and social life. From there, we sometimes distinguish a Neo-Athenian republicanism that highlights the political participation that we find in Hannah Arendt, for example, and a Neo-Roman republicanism, which focuses on freedom. The neo-republicanism of the Irish philosopher Philip Pettit that we are going to see now claims more of the latter. Philip Pettit political thought has an epistemological and metaphysical foundation. The Irish philosopher subscribes to a social holism for which human abilities cannot be the product of a single isolated individual, but in reality are relations with others. He states that no individual is able to manifest a human psychology which is proper to him. The realization of this kind of psychology is something that people can only accomplish in community with others. For Pettit, society does not prevail over individuals as to the causes that drive them. He remains individualistic but maintains that thought can only be produced in common, that the abilities and activities of people could not be developed if they remained alone. As Jean-Fabien Spitz explains in a book devoted to Pettit, the epistemological thinking of the Irish philosopher has political consequences. Political institutions should not be built on the idea that the individual can act alone. We must reject the idea that freedom can be understood as the fundamental value of an individual who thinks or acts alone, according to his own will and preferences. Political values must be listed as common values. For Pettit, this must materialize in the republican assertion of freedom as non-domination. Pettit undertakes to rehabilitate this conception of freedom, born of Roman republicanism and whose apogee crystallized in the Italian cities of the Renaissance, in the ambitions of some American and French revolutionaries, before losing its influence with the rise of classical liberalism. For Pettit, classical liberalism is characterized by the promotion of freedom as non-interference. This conception of freedom is understood as that which prevents an individual from being intentionally interfered with by a third party. It corresponds to the negative freedom as popularized by Isaiah Berlin in his famous essay Two Concepts of Liberty. For Berlin, negative freedom is defined as follows: I am free as long as no one stands in the way of my freedom and actions. I am free as long as I am not forced, that I do not undergo interference. According to Berlin, negative freedom is distinguished from the positive freedom conceived as autonomy and self-realization, and who can assert themselves in participation in civic and political life. For Pettit, this distinction is problematic because it obscures a third way of understanding freedom that is conceived neither as negative nor as positive, it is freedom as non-domination. Freedom as non-domination comes to correct two defects proper to freedom as non-interference. First, it takes into account that interference is not necessarily synonymous with deprivation of liberty. Secondly, it adds that freedom may be affected by factors other than intentional interference. To support the first thesis, Pettit explains that all types of interference should not be placed on the same scale. It is an error of liberalism to confuse, for example, the act of being robbed of money by a delinquent and that of paying taxes to the state. In the second case, says Pettit, there is certainly interference but non-arbitrary interference. An act of interference is not arbitrary to the extent that the obligation is to take into account the interests and ideas of the person undergoing this interference. The person who is subject to non-arbitrary interference is taken into account at the same time as his or her interests by the issuer thereof. If the tax is interference, it is not arbitrary because it is based on the public interest in which the taxable person is included. Another mistake of liberalism is to believe that intentional interference is the unique modality of deprivation of liberty. Republicanism is therefore in this respect more consistent since it states that there can be domination, thus effective obstruction of freedom, without interference. The example of Pettit is famous: I can be the slave of another, without interfering with my choices. My master may indeed be so kind that he chooses not to weigh on my choices, or I can exercise my skill or my sense of flattery to always achieve my ends. I am under the domination of my master, but I enjoy a situation of non-interference. To the extent that this master does not exercise the power of interference that he has over me. If this example is to clearly illustrate a case of domination without interference, such situations are in fact quite common. They express dominance relations between two parties whose most powerful does not need to have a clear intention to dominate. This is the relationship between an employer and an employee, whose bargaining power is weaker, between an abusive husband and his wife, etc. In these examples, the weaker party can develop deference strategies and, of convenience to avoid arbitrary interference. There is inequality between the parties since there is a relationship of domination and the party dominant has the power to interfere, which it may or may not use. That means that the victim of such power acts, on the basis of goodwill, implicit or explicit, from one who is in a position to exercise this power of domination. It is in other words at the mercy of that person. It follows that the victim will not be able to enjoy the psychological status attached to being equal to the other. She is in a situation where fear and deference are constantly on the agenda, not frankness, which accompanies intersubjective equality. For Pettit, equality is conceptually inseparable from freedom understood as non-domination. To want republican freedom implies to desire republican equality. In this perspective, republicanism must favor what Pettit calls individual independence, which is understood as social, political and economic. To be independent, in the sense we understand it here, is to have a space where we are able to act in a normal and appropriate way within society, without having to seek the permission of others or to borrow what belongs to it, and without having to depend on the benevolence of a third party. For Pettit, this independence corresponds to the possession of capabilities such as, defined by Amartya Sen, notably in the book Rethinking Inequality, which we saw in Didicto 14. For Pettit, there are two reasons that justify the intervention of the state in this respect. Firstly, the state protects those who are dependent against forms of domination that they would certainly have to suffer if the state does not interfere. Secondly, the state allows socio-economically dependent individuals more easily access to choices not subject to domination. We will see now that the approach of Pettit has revived republicanism on new bases, including French authors such as Jean-Fabien Spitz, or Cecile Laborde, on which we will linger now. The book of the political theorist Cecile Laborde, French, still an effort to be republican, aims to put forward a republished republicanism in the French context where the Republic is said with a capital letter and tremolos in the voice. It is secularism that is particularly studied in this context. Laborde first distinguishes two types of republicanism. The first is well known, it is a republicanism in official or classic quotation marks in the French context, and which abounds in institutional discourses, among men and women politicians, and which culminated in the implementation of the 2004 law on the wearing of conspicuous religious symbols in schools. The other is in a more open relationship to secularism. Laborde calls it tolerant republicanism, for which religious symbols can be worn within the school, and that wanting to ban them leads to effects contrary to those sought: exclusion, intolerance, especially for young Muslim girls who wear the veil. For Laborde, a coherent republicanism cannot lead to a closed, ethnocentric and paternalistic secularism that excludes. However, she does not join the so-called tolerant republicanism in that he only thinks that terms of recognition of religious minorities by the majority without thinking of the overall context, both social and economic. We must go beyond official or classical republicanism and republicanism, tolerant and multicultural, to result in a critical republicanism inspired by Pettit. Critical republicanism does not attach itself to an abstract ideal, blind to differences, nor does it stick to a simple recognition of minorities and their supposed peculiarities. Critical republicanism aims at the non-domination which passes by a social egalitarianism in which all types of inequalities, social, economic, political, are taken into account, and in particular the way they are related to each other according to the contexts. The goal is to achieve universal participation in politics by eliminating the obstacles that are placed on the road of dominated individuals. Discrimination in the private sphere and in the public sphere, at social, economic and political levels. If you like this episode of Politikon, do not hesitate to share it, to subscribe, to activate the small bell to be able to see all the videos which leave, and to make a donation on Tipeee or Utip if the heart tells you. Waiting for the next, I wish you a happy new year. To live a life without arbitrary interference and without domination, get well and see you next time.